What's up? Today we're going to talk about driveline angle or pinion angle, whatever you want to call it. If you're like me, you probably went around and found 7, 8, 9, 10 different views on the correct ways to set pinion angle, driveline angle. What brought me onto this subject was actually doing a transmission swap in my old Mustang here. Now, I did this years ago. I mean, I'm talking probably 9, almost 10 years ago. And at the time, I didn't really think anything about pinion angle or driveline angles. I didn't have the forethought to actually check and see what my original driveline angles were before I did the swap to make sure to match them and whatnot. So I'm going to guess that if you found this video or are looking for this video, you probably have either done a transmission swap, done a rear end swap, or getting ready to do a rear end swap or a transmission swap, or even a whole driveline swap. I have no idea what you're going for. But this came up probably because you have already done it, and now you have all these crazy vibrations or resonance feelings in the car, truck, whatever you have you. So what I'm going to do today is I'm just going to be real with you, and you can take the information as you want and do with it what you will, because you're going to ask 10 different people the same question and you're probably going to get 10 different answers. And sometimes you'll have people really get excited about this to the point where there's some, I don't know, gets heavy. It's a heavy conversation to have with some people. So I'm going to tell you exactly what I have currently that works pretty much perfect. I'm going to tell you what I tried in the past and just be real with you on what was happening. So, long story short, about 9 years ago, I went ahead and decided I wanted to turn my automatic Mustang, which was a nice, reliable C4 car, and just make it more exciting and also have a highway gear that I could get some overdrive, better miles to the gallon out of. So, in doing this, I found a used T5 and I went on to, I think, CJ Pony Parts at the time and bought what I could from Modern Driveline's bolt-in kit for setting up a T5 swap. So I did that. I used all their parts that I could, hydraulic um, clutch release, throw out bearing, all that kind of fun stuff. And I used the used T5. Well, after doing so, it worked fine, but I found 55, 60 miles an hour, I would have this weird resonance that would, the faster I went, it would increase. I chased my tail on everything. I replaced suspension parts. I had the wheels rebalanced probably 10 times, I'm sure. I tried different wheels just to see if that was an issue. I literally actually borrowed a friend's wheels and put them on the car, went around, nothing changed. So I tried different kinds of trans mounts. I tried factory trans mounts. I tried whatever Pony Parts had. I tried polyurethane mounts and all these other sorts of situations to try to fix this problem and never had any ounce of change. So then fast forward to a few years later, I ended up blowing through that transmission and replaced it with a brand new T5Z and thought, you know what? Maybe that's it. Maybe there's something wrong with my used transmission because I bought it off Craigslist, and we all know how well things from Craigslist usually perform. So put the brand new T5Z out of Summit Racing, same darn thing. I was at my wit's end. So then I really started trying to find out what information I could about, what driveline angles can change from just swapping things around. Obviously, the T5 case is larger. It's taller than the top loader or something that would have went into these cars at the time. So had I been able to measure these angles, well, I could have measured these angles, but I just didn't know any better. So I didn't measure before I did swap. So I have no idea what the actual factory angles are, but I'm going to make a good educated guess on what I've found that's finally worked. So if you're doing this particular swap in a Mustang or something with rear leaf springs, basically what you're going to want is close to zero in the back. I mean, perfectly, 0 degrees from the ground. You are going to want to have your transmission at 3 or 4 degrees down. Okay. Now the ups and downs confuses people. So here's the easy way to think of it. Tail shaft, the very end points down to the ground. Okay. That's your down measurement. So 3 or 4 degrees down. Okay. Now, if they're talking rear end, it's almost the opposite. Okay. So instead of coming down for the rear end, this is up for the rear end. So when it's down, down, up. Okay. Basically, parallel is how you want to think of zero, right? So what this does, and this is where the arguments come into play. When you're going down the road, your rear end on your leaf spring car is going to actually want to walk itself up. It is literally going to pull itself up from how the ring and pinion gear works. It's how it's designed. If you have these completely parallel while sitting and then you go down the road, your rear end is going to try and walk up. Now, when this doesn't happen is if you have a different set rear end setup, or you have cow tracks or some sort of rear sway bar or something that's going to limit it from actually walking physically. But you have to have something back there. If you just have regular leaf springs, it will walk. And I know that's a big debate. And people say, well, it walks, and then as soon as you slow down or come to a cruising speed, it goes back down. No, I'm telling you, it doesn't. And in fact, if you put any weight in the rear end of the car, say you're going on a road trip or you're throwing your kids in the back of the car like I tried, that rear end is actually going to come up then right off the bat because you're putting weight in, you're changing how much weight is on the rear end, and the leaf springs will sag and your rear end will actually pick itself up. So, my high suggestion to you is to have about 2 or 3 degrees difference. Okay, so by difference, I mean if you come down at 3 degrees here from your transmission, I really suggest having 0 or 1 degrees, 0 or 1 degrees facing up. Okay, that's going to give you a 2 to 3 degree range to where you actually have when you're going down the road, and it's going to pick itself up and it's going to be close to parallel for your U joints to actually function. I'll share with you what I actually did and what I started out with that caused my vibrations. So, to start with what I had after I did the swap, I used the modern Driveline mount and put everything in. I was afraid to death of cutting the floor or having to modify anything because everything's original, and these floor pans and framing sections are actually really, really nice. And living in Ohio, you just don't see that very often anymore. So I really didn't want to hack anything up. So when I actually got to measuring from the factory, my rear end was at 0 degrees, and this was at 6.5 degrees down. That's a tremendous amount down. So what I did was I took as many washers as I possibly could and I stacked up onto this mount. And I was able to get it up to 4.5 degrees down. And that stayed at 0. I tried some trial and error things, and everybody I found said, make them the same, make them parallel, and that'll fix your issues. So then I set out and I found some leaf spring shims that you can put right underneath the axle tubes, and it will walk up or down, whichever way you put them, your rear end. So I got I think it was a 4 or 4.5 degree shim, and I put it in, and this was 4.5 degrees down, and my rear end was like 4.2 degrees. It was darn near perfect, and they were right in line with each other. I thought it was going to fix the issue. I head down the street, hop on the highway to check it out, and no lie, I hit 45 miles an hour, and my rear view mirror about shook off of the car. I got really lucky, and I was smart enough to do this on a Sunday afternoon where there was virtually no traffic. I got off at the next exit, and I limped home. I never could even get over 50 miles an hour. It was so bad. So that was, that told me that theory people had on that particular situation, it doesn't work. So I did some more reading, and people said, well, put it a few degrees down from where it's at, leave about where it's at. Okay. So I bought another set of leaf spring shims. This time it was a 2 degree shim. And so I put it underneath. So then I had my 4.5 degrees down, and then I had about 2 or 2.5 degrees up. So it's just below to where it would actually, kind of walk in that symmetry. I took it out and it was much better. But once I hit 65 miles an hour, um, it had that same resonance came right back again. So I was able to distinguish that the issue and the problem this whole time definitely is driveline angle related. I left those shims in and drove it for several years that way. I went on power tour, but it really kind of just stunk because once I hit that 65-mile-an-hour range, that's when that resonance would come up and I wouldn't want to go over. So if you're in the middle of nowhere, you're on a highway where everybody's just flying past you, especially on power tour, everybody goes 75 or 80 miles an hour. So they're blowing past you, zipping past you, and you're just kind of stuck at 65 just to keep that just annoying resonance away. Annoying, and also, you're a 1,000, 1,500 miles or so from home. You don't want anything to break. So you're just banging it along. So going down the road, I think it came to 2019, and I really wanted to get this fixed. I was tired of dealing with the resonance. I thought there should be no reason in the world that you should have this issue. So I finally had to cut the floor to get the shifter assembly piece section through the floor so it could go above a little bit. I cut out what I needed to, I marked it, and I sawed through it with a body saw. Took just honestly, it took an hour, I think. I had to add some extra shims here, and I'm right at like 3.2 degrees down. I mean, pretty much perfect. In fact, if you check your intake manifolds, they're actually machined to have a 3 or 4 degree uh, downward slope and keep that carburetor flat. So I was actually able to put a straight edge on my carburetor and find out that that was pretty much at zero. Now they build that into that for a reason, knowing that that's where your factory driveline angles are going to be. And so I left that there. I set it to about 3.2 degrees down. And then I took that. Well, actually, first, what I did was I tried to have that shim in the back to where it was pretty close to normal and see what it was like. And it actually drove pretty good that way. If I was by myself, I had no problems whatsoever. The only time I felt a resonance was when I was getting on the highway. And that was like punching it or whatever. Not necessarily punching it, but just giving a little gas to ease in and merge with traffic. So then the next time I drove it that I had the issue was I actually put my wife, both my kids, a full cooler, and at the time my youngest was a little smaller, so we had his stroller, so the whole back was packed down, the family was in there, so rear end was sagging, down to its bottom perches. Now, I will also say it's got new springs, it's got new shocks, so that's not a problem. This is not some I got 60-year-old suspension parts on here. I got good Eaton springs, everything's nice. So we go out to this car show about 45 minutes away, a lot of highway driving, and I felt this resonance come back again. And especially happened when I would punch it. In fact, when we came home, I punched it to get on the highway because I have a young son who always hollers at me to go faster, Daddy, go faster. So I did, and we actually felt resonance to where I'm pretty sure the rear end actually itself walked up and hit the pinion snubber because we felt for a second or two a shake in the actual floor. Even my wife looked over at me and was like, "What's that?" I'm like, "I don't know." So I finally do reading and reading and reading, and I can't find it anymore to save my life. But there was a website I found where a page in it had a thing about driveline angles. So I read it, and it was the most informative of them all. And it said, big letters, if you have a factory setup suspension with factory style leaf springs, no cow tracks, no nothing, you want to be about 2 to 3 degrees down from where your tail shaft comes down. And you want to keep your engine transmission driveline angle about 3 to 4 degrees. So I did that. I pulled the shim out, and instead of getting a 1 degree shim or whatever it was, I just left it at 0. So we're at 3.2 degrees down, and we're at 0. It has made this car such a dream to drive. I can't even tell you. So, being that the 0 in the back came from the factory setup, I'm going to bet that that was how they had the driveline set up from the factory. I would love to be able to go back in time and measure what the C4 actually hung down at and see. If you have a factory original car, go outside, throw your front end up on ramps, and jack up the rear, put it on jack stands so your suspension's loaded, and test it out. See what your angles read at. Um, I would love to know. Put them down in the comments. If you have an actual untouched, unmolested factory car, tell me what your driveline specs are. That would be awesome information from the internet to have, because it's really not talked about in the factory manuals at all. They had a special rotunda tool that they would put on the rear end, and then they would zero it out and put it over and stick it on the drive shaft, and it had a certain degree to be in from there. That's about all that they tell you for spec wise from the Ford, even the 5 stack of books from the shop manuals from Ford. So if there's anything I can tell you, is to try to shoot for that 3 to 4 down and about 0, maybe 1 degrees, and 1 degrees with the pinion snout going up. If you're in a modified car, a lowered car, you just open up a whole nother set of animals. And if you're doing drag racing, they claim you want to be about 5 to 7 degrees down. So even if this is at 3 down, 5 degrees would be, let's see, so 0, that's 3, so -2. So your snout would actually be pointing down to the ground, about 2 degrees if your angle here is 3. So how do you do this? How do you measure this? No, a 2-post lift is totally not how you do this. This is purely for purposes that you can see what I'm doing right now. What you want to do is have your front loaded on either jack stands, or the easiest way is some wood blocks or some ramps that you can pull up onto to keep the wheels loaded. And then you want to come back in the back, lift your rear end axle up, put some jack stands underneath of it, measure your front and your rear wheels, and make sure that they're pretty much, identical to each other. If the front's up 12 inches off the ground, keep the back up 12 inches off the ground. Now, how do you do this? There's a couple tools for this. All right, your 2 easiest tools for this. I know I'm out of frame right now. Here's the first one. This is your old school style magnetic, angle finder. This is much better. It's about $25. It zeroes itself out. It's much more accurate, and it makes things a little bit easy on you. So if you use this, that's fine. But what you need to do is you'll have to come down to the ground and see when you put it on the ground, it'll stabilize, and you'll have to see what your floor is at. So instead of being able to zero this out, you're going to have to see if, okay, I have to start at 2 degrees for when I'm measuring, because that's what my concrete's at, or blacktop, whatever you do. As to where this, you can set this guy on the ground and you'll be able to give it a reference. And right now I just zeroed it at where I'm at. So then you can put it up onto your, drive shaft or your rear end snout here, and that will read, real values off of what your floor grade is. So the easiest way to do this is you're going to come over here. I'm going to put it on the ground. I'm going to zero this out. Obviously, this is not going to be accurate at all. You can put it on a nice flat surface that you know is good and flat, like we're here, where the seal cup is for the transmission. Obviously, it's not going to be able to give anything. What would really help you is if you take your drive shaft out. That's really going to make things easy. You can also take a piece of known good flat metal or bar stock or some sort of other tool that you know for a fact is flat and extended off that. Like here, I got a piece of angle. I can put it right here and have it be an extension right here. Okay, so you can do that. You can take that measurement. Let's say it's 3.2 degrees. You're going to come back here and you're going to do the same thing. Come off of this snout or come off of a what you know for a fact is a nice straight piece of metal. Okay, so I've got this on this bolt head here, and now putting that there, I can read that that's 0 degrees as well. Now here's the problem with doing this on a 2-post lift or something that doesn't have your wheels loaded. When I lift this off the ground, this suspension is going to sag and it's going to change all of these angles. It's just not going to be accurate at all. So it's not something that you want to do for good practice for accuracy. When you have all the wheels loaded and the suspension loaded, even if there's nothing under the rear wheels, you'll have the springs, retracted just the way they are. If you are sitting on the ground, that's going to be the way you do it. So again, if you have different types of suspensions where you have, like a Chevelle or something that's got coil springs in the back, you're not going to have the twist that you do on leaf springs. So keep that in mind. I think they say 1 degree or 2 degrees for that type of suspension. Again, that's another debate for people to get into with that type of suspension, which is totally cool. They also make a bunch of aftermarket parts now that you can add heim joints in and set your rear end to exactly where it is. And if it's 3 degrees down and 2 degrees up, that's where it stays. You can hammer down as much as you want, it stays there. And that's also dependent upon the type of car that you have and the type of suspension that you have and how deep your pockets are. But for the vast majority of people, I know that you're going to be hopping in, you're going to want to go down the street and just throw your wife, kids, grandkids, whatever, and just go for a ride. So keeping these settings is highly what I recommend if you're just doing that. If you're going to a track every so often, you're really not going to have the suspension working often and hard enough to really need that actual down force. So that's one thing you have to be real with yourself on is what are you actually going to use your car for once you swap it out? Are you going to be driving mostly a track once or twice to see what it does? Or are you going to be at the track all the time? It's going to be on the trailer, off the trailer. And I think that's part of where the confusion and the fist fights come in and pitchforks and fire and brimstone from people on this argument is that everybody does differently with their cars. Now, here's the weird thing that I have noticed is that some people don't report at all doing these swaps, never stacking shims, never doing anything and having 0 issues. Well, I'm going to translate that honestly to just people just don't drive them. They don't load anything down in the rear of them to where you would have any sag in the back from kids or luggage or things like that. And honestly, most of the time, people that have classic cars that have all this stuff swapped in, they go out a few times a year. They hit the ice cream parlor or the cruising down the street. They never see 50 miles an hour. They never see 70 miles an hour. They never really do much of anything other than a little bit of idle time or cruising down the street banging through the gears. You're not going to notice nor care anything about that if that's all you're doing. Also, the other thing is people just, insinuate automatically, oh, it's an old car. It's just what it does. That's not it at all. In the 60s, people used to blast on the highway going cross-country road trips, fill the back completely full of kids and luggage and everything else. So they would have not tolerated that either. You would have taken it right back to the dealership and say, hey, man, this thing shakes like hell. What's up? So think of that, too, is you have to realize that these cars were made to go down the expressway 55, 60, 65, 70 all day long, and people did it all the time. So the other thing, too, if you're also having problems, check your suspensions out. Do you have any worn out parts? Do you have 60-year-old rubber and suspension parts on your car? Also, is your car aligned well? Not just a good enough thing, but did you actually make sure that they put good alignment specs on it? A lot of times, if you take them to your tire discount places, they will set them up to the 60 specs, which didn't have much caster in them, but then now everybody's putting modern radial tires and big wheels and stuff on to where they could use some more camber or caster and help things actually drive nice. Nobody's running these really on bias plies anymore. If you don't have good suspension setup like that, you can also have some vibrations and things. So I hope this helps. Be honest, try it out. Maybe you go through a couple different things like I did. A lot of times, trial and error is the best way to find out, how to fix information, how to fix the cars yourself. Find out whatever information you can online. We have the most information at our fingertips as pretty much any timeline in human history that we're aware of. So use it. Try it out. So hope this helps. Have a good one.